Okay, so what you're looking at here is an old motorcycle tank, which is ready to be primed, sanded down and finished. Well, eventually. For the time being, the main problem is that it's full of rust. As you can see, all I've done here is reformed it with the huge dents and everything is just simply not visible anymore. I've used Milliput, you use whatever you like. So as you see there, that's rust. It's a very rusty tank. I'll just explain some of the methods that I use to deal with this. Okay, firstly, remove this, turn it over. Where the fuel tap sits, I like to use a blanking plate, so I constructed this from a little piece of steel, just drilled 2 holes in it. Important thing to note is that the threads for these holes are often rusted. Just use new bolts, don't try to force them because they're quite precious. So the blanking plate itself, just a couple of washers, copper crush washers as well, with some silicone. Now this is not petrol resistant silicone, but it will last for about 24 hours, I expect, at least, which is long enough for me to deal with the rusting issue on this tank. People use all sorts of things to remove rust. My method is to use a proprietary cleaner, I'm not advertising it, and a bunch of screws. So people use hydrochloric acid, phosphoric acid, chains, etc., which may all be more effective, but this suffices for me. So when you do something like this, occasionally pinholes may appear, and from experience they generally appear where the seam is on these old Japanese tanks anyway. So these are pressed together here, kind of the 2 layers. It's very, very thin. So when you're sanding and dealing with these tanks, try not to sand around these areas at all. I'll show you what the problem is. Yeah, you see a little piece of rust, so I can actually flake that away with my finger. Just about. So the rust will probably extend around to this sort of area, and that will need to be sanded down and dealt with, which means that when that's done, the metal will be even thinner. Now this tank is quite old, so subsequent tanks from the 80s and 90s may be made of even thinner material, so I expect that I won't really have any problems with this one. If you do encounter pinholes, it's often recommended that you can deal with them with the help of bronze brazing. While that's possible, I wouldn't suggest it. I'd say use silver solder, simply because this has a lower melting point. So these bronze rods, obviously they do work, but they will start melting before the steel gets really hot. So the bond itself, you have to be quite experienced to be able to get a good bond, and silver solder, because of the higher melting point, will get the whole area quite hot before you apply it. So I would suggest using silver solder. If you haven't got any, then use bronze brazing rods. And that's all really.